Final Fantasy XVI continues to spark debates online about, is it a Final Fantasy game? Is it not your Final Fantasy? We recently reacted to a review on this channel that basically walked through and said that it was not really a game, that it was boring. They had only played about 4 hours, so we're kind of anticipating maybe the person that made that review playing a little bit further and changing their tune. And now I have an article I want to react to that's basically saying this is what God of War Ragnarok should have been, which I find to be sort of an interesting premise. That's why I found the idea to be interesting, because I actually enjoyed Ragnarok quite a bit. I thought their focus on story was quite good. I wish that I would have had more time to go back and really soak in the side quests and the side missions. I've heard very good things about a lot of the side story missions. I did one by accident that was actually really, really cool in Ragnarok, and I always thought that was one of the stronger points of that second game. God of War 2018 is, in my mind, a pivotal title for PlayStation. I thought it was rather excellent storytelling, very, very good voice acting, probably some of the best you could find in the industry. And Ragnarok, I felt, took things forward. And I've been playing Final Fantasy XVI in a very different way than I've approached other games. Typically, the story of a game like Final Fantasy XVI doesn't land on me. The long, drawn-out scenes, sort of the JRPG approach to storytelling is usually one that I don't enjoy, with lots of dialogue, lots of standing around and listening to NPCs talk about different things. And something about the combat, something about the story in Final Fantasy XVI really hooked me. Maybe going in with low expectations allowed the game just to sort of surprise me. A lot of the times when I play a game like this, I go in sort of maybe already stigmatized and thinking, oh, I'm not going to like this. This really isn't going to be an enjoyable experience. So somebody using Final Fantasy XVI to say, well, this is what God of War should have been, I'm actually very interested in that perspective, because I do feel like their approaches to storytelling are so vastly different that I'm curious where they thought Ragnarok aired and where Final Fantasy XVI seems to be doing a better job in their mind. Make sure you hit subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell button if you enjoyed this type of content where we go through, take an opinion, and kind of react to it, and I give you some of my own. So here we have at theloadout.com their article that says Final Fantasy XVI is what God of War Ragnarok should have been. And it says Square Enix has struck gold in the eyes of Final Fantasy XVI players, as FF16 fans claim it is the experience that God of War Ragnarok should offer on PS5. And this is coming from Sam Comrie. It's 2 days old. Let's see what Sam has to say. It's hard to highlight this article too. It's kind of formatting is a little funky. Final Fantasy XVI is already up there with the best PS5 RPG games, and fans of the long-running franchise believe it stands toe-to-toe with some of the PS5's most reputable titles. In fact, FF16 fans are so smitten with the latest entry that some claim it offers an experience that the award-winning God of War Ragnarok should match. Now, in my mind, I don't see these titles as being pitted against each other. I'm a little out of central here. I don't think they're really pitted against each other. I don't feel like when I've played Final Fantasy XVI, I've thought, man, I really wish Ragnarok would have done this, or maybe even Horizon Forbidden West as another example, or one of my all-time favorite games, Hellblade. I think every game has a different approach. And one of the things that Ragnarok does is the single shot format, where the camera never actually cuts from beginning to end. They had to do some pretty unique things with dream sequences and going from Kratos all the way to, where Atreus was. And I thought those were really creative moments as a way of keeping things on a single camera shot. But that artistic intention, that authorial intent, is going to have a huge amount of influence over how the story plays out. It's not going to be done, I don't think, in the same way that Final Fantasy XVI feels like it's sort of trying to strike that HBO Game of Thrones chord, that, they were all required to watch it. And so I don't think I'm seeing the comparison here. Let's see where they take the discussion. Redditor Cocoa Puffs, great name. The Adventures of Clive Rossfield are the way to go. That's what they think. Quote, the game absolutely blew my mind and far exceeded my expectations. The Titan fight, it was like fighting a god, something God of War Ragnarok lacked in my opinion. I love Ragnarok, but it just felt kind of disappointing, says the FF16 fan, bringing the community together to discuss the game's merit. Now, I do think the scope and the size of fights in Final Fantasy XVI is something that is done very well. I actually think it gives it this epic feel. You feel as if you're in this larger set piece. You sort of blow the world up, and then you're this, this big monster, this big icon. And I do think that there were times in God of War where you don't necessarily feel like that. You feel like the set piece is big and you're sort of small within it. I do know that there were some, dragon, like the dragon fight in the first game, not the first game, but 2018. That did kind of have more of an epic feel, but I think it's a little bit different because Kratos can't transform in size. So I think it's difficult to have a god that has that level of power. Like the Baldur fight is one of the more iconic moments in God of War, in my opinion, from the voice acting to just the fact that you couldn't hurt him, like just what that did to Kratos mentally and what it did to the environment, I thought was really, really well done. But again, you're not going to get that same sense of scope and awe and these big, huge moments because Kratos is, a fairly normal-sized dude, normal within, the realm of like big bodybuilders and wrestlers, but still, he's a normal-sized human. He's not, some gigantic, it's not like he got to the size of the world serpent and wrestled with it. So I can see where they're coming from. Like if you really want to have that god-like fight, that was lacking, but I also think it's because that, again, is their interpretation of what Kratos should look like. Somebody says here, I had the exact same thoughts for the entire game. Boss fights in this game feel like entire separate movies. You actually feel like you're fighting god entities, explains Call Me Woe. They add that, quote, modern God of War has great storytelling, but really lacks in epic boss fights when compared to Greek God of War, and FF16 just blew it completely out of the competition. Again, I don't think I can disagree, although I don't necessarily think that was ever my expectation when I played God of War 2018 or God of War Ragnarok. I didn't expect to be in a fight that large. I think some of the larger scale fights did feel cool, but again, you're limited. Like Kratos sort of moves like a linebacker, right? It almost is reminiscent of sort of the way that movement in Gears of War felt. You sort of get that impression that, everything's almost not necessarily on rails, but it's kind of tight. I think it makes it hard. I do think that some of the things they do with Final Fantasy XVI are also in their own way on rails, right? It's almost cinematic. It's kind of quick time event oriented. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way, but I do think that enables them to go big spectacle and go really big and huge and then do these really, really amazing fights. But that doesn't, again, I don't think mean that we didn't get that in Ragnarok. I remember, fighting the big wolf, the big dog, right? That moment was, I think, a really cool moment. But again, it's constrained by the fact that Kratos is of a normal size. So I don't think I can fault. I don't think I can agree with them and count it as a fault. I definitely could see maybe there's room in future God of Wars to give you like that larger scope and sense of being a god or being godlike in size. The Loadout's Final Fantasy XVI review from Cal himself notes the game's exceptional set pieces too, making it an absolute must-own title for PS5 players. One of my biggest frustrations with Final Fantasy XVI is the performance mode. As soon as you come out of combat, it sort of starts to look kind of stuttery and terrible, which really makes navigating some of the nice set pieces not that enjoyable. I'm shocked at how many people aren't taking as much of an issue with that. I think a lot of people are playing at quality mode. You're totally fine, no shame. If you think quality mode's dope and the lower frames per second doesn't bother you, man, I'm kind of jealous of you. I wish I could play games at quality and enjoy them. But I think that's ruining some of the set pieces for me because they are stunning. They're gorgeous. I remember in Digital Foundry's review of the game, they were just sort of notating some of the architecture and the lighting and the shading and how all of that and the shadows, how all of that played out and ended up looking in a way that, was very realistic. But then the minute you start moving on performance mode, it just kind of looks like mush. It's kind of stuttery, and I would really hope to see they would give a performance patch that would enable dynamic resolution to sort of be on all the time. They basically turn that on And they extremely are willing to sacrifice, in an extreme sense, resolution just to give you frames per second. And I think the set piece design would be better suited for me just to maintain that fluidity. I get that it'll get a little bit lower in resolution, and that is a lack of like crispness and clarity. That doesn't really matter if loss of frame rate does the same thing, if not worse, right? If I'm used to 60 in the fight, come out of the fight and it's kind of stuttering, or I get it to town and it's kind of stuttering, all that clarity doesn't matter unless I'm standing still, right? And if you're standing still, largely, your dynamic resolution is not going to really kick in until you start moving around, and it's trying to maintain all of that motion. Others aren't so sure whether Final Fantasy XVI surpasses the bar of quality that God of War Ragnarok pushes. Fellow Redditor Scrizzy comments, quote, I agree with the boss battles and combat being better in FF16, but FF16's questing is so bad. Its looting system is useless, crafting useless, abilities are bare bones. I can't really comment on this because I'm not super far into the game yet. I do feel like some of the questing is a little bit cliche RPG, like, hey, go talk to that guy over there and get a piece of something and then come back and talk to me. You kind of boomerang in town sometimes, or just go do something fairly basic like a fetch quest. I don't know if that's avoidable in games of this size. Yeah, fetch quests and go find the pretty thing and take a picture of it. I mean, I don't know. I think oftentimes we're now being critical of things in games that are part and parcel to game design. They're not necessarily flaws. It's just that familiarity breeds contempt. So the minute oh, this is a fetch quest. Oh, this is this type of quest. You've been playing so many video games that those quests end up falling flat for you, not because they're bad, but because you've done it so many times before in other games. And I don't necessarily know if that's a fault of the game in and of itself. If it's more of an indication, anything, that we're just becoming a little bit jaded as gamers. They add a note that both games have their own pros and cons. They say, quote, Final Fantasy XVI just has so many highs, it makes up for the lows, which is why I'm really enjoying it. The two franchises offer different approaches to storytelling, with current God of War games opting for a highly cinematic approach, utilizing a one-take camera style as a means to keep immersion high. That is good that they made mention of that. I do think artistic intent has to be taken into consideration. Games are going to deliver their stories, their worlds, their set pieces, their characters. They're all going to deliver them in different ways, and that's going to come down to art direction and the vision of who's in charge. What are they really going for? What's the goal? Okay? And I do think that's why you're going to have those differences. I don't necessarily think every game is now having to try to maybe do what Final Fantasy did. If you're doing fantasy or godlike fights, it doesn't necessarily need to do what they've been doing. Respecting the craftsmanship, Conspiracy Dog says, God of War had meaningful exposition, but just the dialogue between Kratos, Atreus, and Mimir. It didn't need two NPCs to explain the backstory and current events. No fetch quests either. This is something I've always really, really praised God of War for, the use of Mimir. I loved the use of the boat in 2018. There were these moments where you were getting great story, and I would kind of wait to get out of the boat because I wanted to find out what happened. That lore building, that world building, without necessarily needing to go grab a piece of paper from a bench and like read it, like what are they talking about here, or beyond that, being able to just go on a quest to learn about some village. Mimir just sort of tells you. One of the things they did that was really, really good in God of War 2018, I know they did it in Ragnarok, I just didn't notice it as often because I was sort of letting the scenes and the story moments kind of play out. But something they did in 2018 that was really smart is they'd be like, more for another time, or they'd make a little remark and you'd get out of the boat. And then you'd get back in the boat and they'd pick up back where they left off. I love that. There were a couple times where I accidentally got out of the boat or triggered an exodus, and it's like, oh wait, I wanted to hear the rest of that. And that was just another way I felt that they did very, very good storytelling and lore building in 2018. Despite the latest Final Fantasy entry selling lower than the Final Fantasy VII Remake. See, people keep making mention of this, and you do realize that Final Fantasy VII Remake sold to more platforms, so it's not a fair comparison. It had a huge advantage in that regard. 16's doing just fine. People keep citing that stat, but they're forgetting that 16's only available on the PS5, and there's less of them in circulation than the number of platforms that FF7 was able to sell on. And FF7's also got a lot of nostalgia attached to it. It's not fair comparison at all. The game is still young and has exciting prospects on the horizon, like a potential crossover with Final Fantasy XIV. No matter which game you prefer, there are always more adventures to go on, so don't forget to keep updated with all the upcoming PS5 games on the horizon. In general, I found this comparison to be fine, and it does, I think, maybe lend ideas to future God of War titles. I don't know what their plans are. You know, the idea is they're going to take Kratos somewhere else. They're kind of done with Norse. There's also the idea that they might do a spin-off game with Atreus. In those events, take some of this into consideration. Transforming into a wolf was pretty cool, you know? All of a sudden having a bear fighting at your side was pretty cool. Maybe going a step up from that and getting quite a bit bigger is another thing they could consider doing. Maybe they could take a little bit of inspiration from Final Fantasy XVI, but I don't think any of this is an indictment of Ragnarok. I think Ragnarok and Final Fantasy XVI are both great stories told in their own way and in their own right. So, let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, hit subscribe and the bell button. Usually this video goes over into a members-only debrief, so consider becoming a member if you want to be a part of that content. And as always, hit subscribe and the bell button, and I'll see you in the next video.